Jasmine Crockett, at just 27 years old, became the youngest press secretary in American history. In just 6 minutes on live television with Stephen Colbert, she left the entire studio speechless. One single remark from her ignited a nationwide uproar. But what drove this young woman to challenge the entire American media right on national television? Jasmine Crockett sat at her desk, the letter from the Late Show team resting heavily in her hands. She could feel the weight of it, an invitation that wasn't a simple gesture of kindness but a carefully crafted trap. This wasn't just another interview. This was a political stage, a showdown, and she was the chosen player. Colbert had invited her not to listen but to expose her, to turn the tables on Trump's spokesperson. A trap so sweetly laid, yet impossible for Jasmine Crockett to refuse. This was the chance she had been waiting for, to stand up for what she believed in, to confront the media, and to reveal the truth to the American people. As Jasmine Crockett stared at the letter, the feeling of tension spread throughout the White House. The entire team was on edge, their nerves shot from the realization that this wasn't a typical appearance. Colbert wasn't just a comedian. He was a symbol of left-wing media, a man known for his biting criticism, his unflinching scrutiny of the Trump administration. The entire team knew that Colbert wasn't going to sit back and let her speak freely. He would come at her with questions designed to corner her, to challenge her, to force her into a position where she could be torn apart. This wasn't going to be easy. The staff at the White House exchanged worried glances. They knew Colbert's track record, his relentless dissection of Trump's policies, his ability to paint a simple interview into a political spectacle. This wasn't just a TV appearance. This was a fight they had to prepare for. And as they whispered among themselves, one question hung in the air. How would Jasmine Crockett handle it? How would she deal with Colbert, who would pull no punches, who would twist every word and every policy to his advantage? But Jasmine Crockett didn't see it the same way. She wasn't afraid. The thought of Colbert's hard-hitting questions didn't make her nervous. If anything, it fueled her determination. She had had enough of standing behind closed doors, behind the shield of others' words. This time, it wasn't about defending Trump. It was about defending herself, her values, and the beliefs she had fought for alongside him. It was about standing up against a media that had done nothing but misrepresent, twist, and tear down everything she stood for. Jasmine Crockett looked out of the window, the sunlight catching her face, casting long shadows across her desk. It felt as if the world outside had gone quiet, like everything had paused just for a moment. In that stillness, she realized something crucial. This wasn't just a fight for Trump's policies. This was a fight for the truth. This was her chance to be heard, to confront the lies and accusations, and to prove that she wasn't just a puppet of the system. She was a fighter, and she was ready to take on whatever Colbert threw her way. The next morning, Jasmine Crockett boarded the plane to New York. The flight felt like the calm before the storm. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, she felt a fire ignite within her, the tension of the coming battle building with every mile. She thought about the upcoming interview. How would she face Colbert? How would she stay composed when each question felt like it could be a trap designed to break her? She didn't know exactly what would happen on that stage, but one thing was clear: she wouldn't be intimidated. She wouldn't back down. The truth had to be told, and she would be the one to tell it. Just hours from now, Jasmine Crockett would stand face-to-face with Stephen Colbert, the man who had mocked, criticized, and clashed with the Trump administration countless times. But this time, things would be different. This time, Colbert wouldn't control the narrative. Jasmine Crockett would be in charge. She knew that no matter how prepared Colbert was, the only person who could determine the outcome of this confrontation was her. She stared at her phone, the screen glowing in her hands, as she opened Twitter. With a steady hand, she typed out a single, pointed message. "It's time, Stephen. Thanks for the invite, but don't expect me to stay silent." With a deep breath, Jasmine Crockett hit tweet. The small, simple post sent ripples through the digital world, igniting a chain of events no one could have predicted. The stage was set, the battle lines drawn. What had started as an innocent invitation was now something much larger, something far more explosive than anyone could have imagined. Before the taping, the air in Jasmine Crockett's office felt suffocating, thick with an indescribable tension. She sat silently, her fingers gripping the coffee cup, the warmth of it doing little to calm the storm inside her. It was as if a hurricane was about to hit, and there was nothing she could do to change its course. What she was about to face was no ordinary interview. It was a battle for survival. Her assistants were busy preparing everything, but Jasmine Crockett couldn't shake the sense of unease that gripped her. Images of Colbert, his sharp questions, his mocking gaze, that sarcastic smile, kept swirling in her mind, refusing to let her focus. And then her phone buzzed. A message from a close friend on Colbert's team. They said, "Tonight will be a night you won't forget." Jasmine Crockett stared at the screen, feeling like a sharp blade had pierced her chest. A night you won't forget. That wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. This had escalated far beyond a typical interview. She knew that it wasn't just Colbert who had prepared for this evening. The entire The Late Show team had been meticulous in their planning. They weren't just interested in political discourse. They wanted to unseat her as the spokesperson, to expose her to millions of viewers. Every question, every glance, would be a sharp dagger aimed at her career and her loyalty. With each passing moment, the air grew heavier, thicker with the impending sense of doom. She could feel it, the crew outside preparing for a public execution, a battle with no escape. But Jasmine Crockett refused to back down. She stood up, walking to the window. Outside, New York City buzzed with life, lights flickering in the distance, the pulse of a city that never slept. But in this space, there was only her. She knew she was about to step into a challenge that no one could have predicted. This was the moment of truth. Everything would change after tonight. In her mind, a powerful thought echoed. This is not a talk show. This is a battlefield. The tension in the room was so thick it felt as though everything had gone silent. The noise outside seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of her own rapid breathing. Jasmine Crockett glanced at a photo of her family, then turned back to her computer screen, where soon she would face the judgment of the entire world. But it was in these moments that Jasmine Crockett found strength in the truth. This wasn't the time to hide. She would face it head-on, stand tall, to prove that even as a young woman, she had the power to change the media landscape. Then the door swung open, and an assistant stepped in, announcing, "We're ready. Colbert is waiting outside." Jasmine Crockett stood, the feeling of a warrior preparing for battle settling into her bones. Her mind was sharp, as if she had overcome all fear. She knew that today would be the day Colbert would not easily turn the tables. Outside the stage, whispers from Colbert's team filled the air. The crew was preparing for a grand reveal, a masterfully executed trap. Jasmine Crockett wasn't afraid, but she couldn't ignore the palpable tension in the air. This was it. This wasn't just a casual conversation. It was a battle of beliefs, a clash of truths. The noise behind the scenes grew louder with each passing second, like an undercurrent building towards an inevitable wave. Jasmine Crockett stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. She was dressed in a simple outfit, an oversized black jacket paired with crisp white sneakers. The look was minimalist yet powerful. Her posture exuded the kind of unwavering confidence that was a hallmark of someone who had faced countless battles. Yet her eyes, sharp, focused, told a different story. They seemed to slow down everything around her, giving her a sense of clarity and a sharpness of purpose. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett could feel the weight of the situation more than ever before. It wasn't just about walking onto a set to speak her mind. It was about facing an entire culture, a system that wanted to tear her down, and doing so with everything she had. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her coffee mug, the warmth doing little to soothe the fire burning inside her. She could hear the murmur of Colbert's team preparing outside, cameras being adjusted, voices murmuring instructions. But the noise from behind the curtain only made the pressure greater. This wasn't just another talk show appearance. This wasn't a routine interview. This was her trial by fire, her moment of reckoning, and the weight of it hit her like a heavy stone in her chest. She had faced public scrutiny before, but this time it was different. This time, everything she stood for was being challenged. The media had already made up its mind about her, and the moment she stepped on that stage, they would scrutinize every word, every gesture. They would dissect her. There would be no room for error. The stakes were higher than ever. Jasmine Crockett exhaled, looking out the window at the sprawling city of New York. The lights shimmered in the distance, the city never sleeping, never slowing down. The world outside was full of motion, full of life, but in this moment, everything inside her felt still. It was just her, alone with her thoughts, alone with the knowledge that in a few minutes, everything would change. Her heart pounded in her chest as she prepared herself to walk into the lion's den. "Remember, Jasmine Crockett," she whispered to herself, "tonight is yours. This is no longer just an interview. This is your battlefield." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence consume her. Then, with a steadying breath, she stood up. Her movements were calm, deliberate, as if she had already entered the arena of battle. The fear, the nerves, the doubt, they had all melted away into something stronger, something unbreakable. She wasn't here to apologize. She wasn't here to play by anyone's rules. She was here to make a statement. She was here to fight for everything she believed in. The sound of her heels clicking against the cold floor echoed in the otherwise silent room as she made her way toward the door. She could hear the muffled laughter, the chatter of Colbert's crew preparing for the show, but it only made her feel more resolute. She had prepared for this moment. She had steeled herself for what lay ahead. There was no turning back now. As the door swung open, Jasmine Crockett stepped into the studio. The applause from the audience was deafening, the room filled with the kind of energy that only a live audience could generate. But among the applause, there were also jeers, sharp whistles of mockery. Jasmine Crockett felt the sting of the disapproval, felt the eyes of those who had already judged her, the ones who saw her as nothing more than a puppet, a voice without substance. Their sneers and hisses were like arrows aimed directly at her, each one intended to wound her, to make her falter. But instead of crumbling, Jasmine Crockett stood tall. The more they jeered, the more they mocked, the stronger she became. She moved with purpose, walking towards the chair at the center of the stage. With each step, the weight of the moment grew heavier, but so did her resolve. This wasn't just about surviving the night. It was about taking control. It was about showing everyone that she wasn't the fragile, easy target they thought she was. She was Jasmine Crockett, and tonight, the world would see who she truly was. As she sat down in the chair, her posture was perfect, straight, confident, commanding. She knew that every eye in the room was on her. Every camera was trained on her face, waiting to capture her every reaction. The media, the critics, Colbert, they were all waiting for her to stumble, for her to falter. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going to back down now. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of the people who had already made up their minds about her. The left-wing media, those who had already decided that she was just another voice of the establishment, a puppet of Trump. They wanted her to fail. They wanted her to make a mistake. But she wasn't going to give them that. Today, she wasn't just a spokesperson. She wasn't just a figurehead. Today, she was a warrior, a woman with a voice, with a purpose, with a truth that could no longer be silenced. The applause began to die down, replaced by a heavy silence. Jasmine Crockett could feel it, the energy shifting in the room. The whispers of doubt had faded. The mockery had softened. Now, they were waiting. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and Jasmine Crockett was ready. She turned to face Colbert, meeting his gaze head-on. His eyes were full of that familiar gleam, mocking, daring her to make a mistake. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't afraid. She had faced worse than this. She had endured more than anyone could imagine. And now, it was time to prove that she was more than just a spokesperson for Trump. She was more than just a voice in the political machine. Tonight, she was going to redefine herself in front of the world. Colbert greeted her with his signature sarcasm, but Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. She had fought for her beliefs for far too long to let anyone, least of all Colbert, dictate her story. Tonight, she wasn't just defending Trump's policies. She was defending her own truth. The door to the Late Show swung shut, and Jasmine Crockett found herself face-to-face with Stephen Colbert. His trademark smile was on his lips, but his eyes were sharp, cutting through her like a blade, full of mockery. The applause from the audience echoed through the studio, but it quickly faded into a deep silence as Colbert began to speak. Is working for Trump like babysitting? His questions sliced through the air, each word aimed directly at Jasmine Crockett, shifting the atmosphere from lighthearted to heavy with tension. The studio erupted into laughter, whistles, and jeers. Jasmine Crockett could feel the disdain in every eye, both from the audience and from Colbert himself. The question wasn't just a casual jab. It was an attack on her dignity. It was an attempt to tear down her credibility, not just as Trump's spokesperson, but as a person. The question was meant to humiliate, to expose her as an unworthy figure in the public eye, one who was just another cog in the machine, a question that sought to diminish her in front of millions of viewers. The bright lights from the stage illuminated Jasmine Crockett, each beam of light feeling like it was bearing down on her, scrutinizing her every move. The world, it seemed, was waiting for her to falter, waiting for her to make a mistake, to slip up. But instead of hesitation, something unexpected happened. Jasmine Crockett felt more awake, more alert than she had ever been. A small, knowing smile tugged at the corners of her lips, calm but resolute. She wasn't afraid of his question. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no sign of weakness. She could feel the outrage from her supporters and the contempt from her detractors, but she refused to let that deter her. This moment was hers. She would not let it slip away. Jasmine Crockett placed her hand on the table, leaned forward slightly, and looked straight into Colbert's eyes. Every word she spoke was deliberate, like a finely honed weapon he wouldn't be able to dodge. "Babysitting," she repeated, her voice soft but laced with sarcasm. "No, Stephen, I don't babysit. I work for the man you like to call immature. But if you ask me, he's the only one willing to stand up and do what everyone else is too afraid to do. And as for you, all you do is sit in your chair criticizing, making money from the nonsense people want to hear." The room went silent. It wasn't because Jasmine Crockett's words were too soft. They were far from it. It was because her response was so direct, so resolute, that it took everyone by surprise. The silence that followed wasn't just one of stunned disbelief. It was respect. Jasmine Crockett had made her move. She hadn't let herself be swept away by Colbert's provocations. Instead, she stood tall, faced the challenge head-on, and hit back with an answer so sharp that it left him momentarily speechless. Stephen Colbert, renowned for his biting sarcasm and quick wit, sat in silence. It wasn't a sign of defeat, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of surprise, a hint of uncertainty. He had expected her to be rattled, to stammer, to flinch. But instead, she had hit him with a response so confident, so measured, that it threw him off balance. The man who prided himself on outsmarting his guests had been outdone by Jasmine Crockett's poise. The audience, initially stunned into silence, began to break out into light applause. Some people smiled, others clapped softly, but the shift was palpable. There was a newfound respect in the room. Jasmine Crockett hadn't done what everyone had expected. She hadn't crumbled under the pressure. She had stood her ground, answered directly, and defended herself with a strength they hadn't anticipated. The tension in the studio didn't dissipate immediately. Colbert maintained his signature smile, but it was less sharp now, less certain. He knew the night wouldn't go as smoothly as he had imagined. Jasmine Crockett had proven herself to be a formidable force. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett showed the world, and Colbert, that she wasn't just a talking head. She wasn't a puppet of the Trump administration. She was a warrior, ready to face any challenge, no matter how sharp or pointed the questions. She had taken control of the conversation and shown that she wasn't afraid to stand up for herself, her values, and everything she believed in. Tonight, Jasmine Crockett had not only defended her boss, but she had defended herself, and in doing so, she had won the respect of those who had doubted her. Jasmine Crockett's gaze never wavered from Colbert. The sting of his derisive, mocking question felt like an icy wave crashing over her. But instead of retreating, she felt something stir inside her, a powerful sense of awakening. This wasn't the first time she had faced such contempt. It wasn't even the first time she'd been made the target of ridicule. But this time, she would not let anyone make her feel small. She would not let anyone strip away her dignity. The lights in the studio were blinding, but they illuminated her face with a fierce intensity, reflecting the unwavering confidence and quiet determination in her eyes. Across from her, Colbert sat still, wearing his trademark smirk, as if he had already won. He believed that with his biting question, she would falter, that she would become flustered and uncertain, like so many others who had crossed him before. But Jasmine Crockett was not that woman. She didn't shrink in the face of ridicule. She rose to meet it. She straightened in her seat, shoved her chair back with authority, and stood tall. Her movements deliberate and strong, Her gaze locked with Colbert's, a fierce challenge in her eyes. "I don't babysit," she began, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of someone who had long since stopped fearing anyone's judgment. Her words cut through the silence like a blade, precise and deliberate. The entire studio grew still, the audience hanging on every syllable. "I work with the man you call immature. But if you ask me, he's the only one brave enough to do what others are too afraid to do. And as for you," she continued, her voice picking up strength, "you just sit in your chair criticizing, making money off the nonsense people want to hear." The words landed like a heavy blow, a forceful punch to the mockery that had been thrown at her. With every syllable, Jasmine Crockett dismantled the carefully constructed persona Colbert had tried to impose on her. She wasn't just a talking head. She wasn't some figure to be mocked or ridiculed. She was a woman with her own voice, her own values, and she was standing her ground. She looked him square in the eyes, refusing to blink, refusing to show even a hint of hesitation. She didn't fear his insults. She didn't fear his disdain. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. For a brief moment, the entire studio was engulfed in an unexpected silence. The usual noise of the audience, the laughter, the jeers, the applause, vanished. In that rare, tense moment, no one dared to breathe. The weight of Jasmine Crockett's words lingered in the air, forcing everyone to stop and listen. Colbert, who had been the one dominating the conversation, who had prided himself on his sharp tongue, now found himself momentarily disarmed. The silence stretched on, the tension palpable. Jasmine Crockett stood tall, unflinching. She hadn't just answered Colbert's question, she had flipped the narrative. This wasn't a simple exchange of words, it was a declaration. She wasn't here to play by his rules. She wasn't here to be the subject of his ridicule. She was here to stand up for herself, for the truth, and for everything she had worked for. Colbert smiled again, but this time the smile was strained, uncomfortable. It was no longer the confident, mocking grin of someone who thought he had the upper hand. This was the smile of someone who had just been caught off guard, who had realized that the fight he thought he could easily win wasn't going to be as simple as he had imagined. There was a flicker of surprise in his eyes, a moment of discomfort he couldn't hide. Jasmine Crockett's confidence had shaken him. For the first time in their exchange, Colbert didn't have the upper hand, and he knew it. Jasmine Crockett stood there, unyielding, her posture straight, her voice as steady as steel. This was no longer about defending Trump. This was about defending herself, about making it clear to the world that she wasn't just a puppet, a mouthpiece. She was a person with her own convictions, her own beliefs, and she would not be silenced. A few seconds passed, and the studio remained silent. Colbert was struggling to recover, to find the words to reassert his control over the conversation. He tapped his fingers lightly on the desk, attempting to compose himself. Finally, he spoke again, but there was a noticeable shift in his tone. "Well, I think you've made quite the point," Colbert began, but his words lacked the usual bite, the usual sharpness. "So who exactly do you think is saving America, in your opinion? And why does it require the protection of people you call playing pretend?" But Jasmine Crockett wasn't fazed. She didn't let his attempt to regain control throw her off. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She stood there, unwavering, her eyes locked with his, her presence commanding. She wasn't going to be distracted by his faint challenge. She wasn't going to let him steer the conversation in the direction he wanted. Her voice, when it came, was calm but powerful. America is being saved by people who are willing to make hard decisions, to do what others won't. It's easy to sit back and criticize, to make jokes, to sell stories, but that's not what leadership looks like. She paused, letting her words sink in. "And as for the people you call pretenders, maybe it's time you took a good look at who's actually making a difference." The studio was still, the audience caught between two opposing forces. Jasmine Crockett had not only answered Colbert's question, she had redirected the entire conversation, reclaiming the narrative. No longer was she the target of his mockery. Now, Colbert was the one being questioned, and Jasmine Crockett was the one who had turned the tables. The audience, initially stunned into silence, began to slowly clap. It wasn't a wild, boisterous round of applause, but there was a quiet respect in the air. The applause was soft, tentative at first, but it grew. Jasmine Crockett had stood her ground, not just for Trump, but for herself. She had shown everyone in that room, and everyone watching, that she was not just a puppet. She was a force to be reckoned with. Colbert, though still trying to maintain his composure, was visibly unsettled. His usual air of confident authority had slipped. He attempted to regain his posture, but the crack in his veneer was obvious. The night wasn't going the way he had planned. Jasmine Crockett had done something Colbert hadn't expected. She had outsmarted him, not with snarky remarks or sharp jabs, but with simple, undeniable truth. She had turned his question back on him, and in doing so, she had shifted the entire dynamic of the conversation. Colbert had become the one on the defensive, and Jasmine Crockett had become the one everyone was watching with new eyes. Tonight, Jasmine Crockett had shown the world who she really was. She wasn't just another political figure. She was a woman of strength, of conviction, and of courage. She had fought not just for Trump but for the truth, and in doing so, she had won a battle that no one had expected her to win. The studio seemed to freeze, the air so still that you could hear the breath of every person in the room. The entire audience seemed to pause in a moment that stretched on forever. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. The crowd had just witnessed Jasmine Crockett counterattack with a confidence and sharpness that no one had expected from her. The mocking laughter, the whistles full of disdain, which had just moments ago filled the room, fell completely silent. It was an incredible shift, as if the audience had been frozen in that very instant. It was a moment where Colbert, the host who always had control of the conversation, suddenly fell silent. He sat there staring at Jasmine Crockett, but his lips couldn't form the words. Even Colbert's own crew couldn't help but notice. Today, they were facing a very different opponent. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just responded to a question. She had turned the attack back at Colbert, using the very weapon he was most familiar with, words. But unlike him, she didn't wield sarcasm or trivial criticism. Instead, she replied with sharp clarity, decisiveness, and strength, dismantling everything Colbert had expected from her. The audience, who had prepared themselves to ridicule Jasmine Crockett, now began to realize a truth they couldn't ignore. This young woman wasn't like anyone they had seen on TV before. She wasn't the talking head the media had painted her to be. She wasn't just a spokesperson for Trump. She was a true fighter, with a confident demeanor and sharp arguments, a woman unafraid to face challenges, even if those challenges came from one of America's most famous talk show hosts. A light round of applause began to break the silence from one corner of the studio. It wasn't a loud, boisterous roar, but it was filled with a quiet admiration. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just answered Colbert's question. She had created an unforgettable moment, one that forced the audience to reconsider everything they had judged about her. She had captured every eye in the room. Not everyone agreed with Jasmine Crockett. There were still a few subtle whistles from one side of the studio, but the respect was beginning to spread. The looks that once dripped with disdain had now shifted to something else, something akin to reevaluation. This young woman had silenced them, not just with the sharpness of her words, but with the strength and conviction she displayed. Colbert, though still trying to maintain his jovial air, no longer had the sharpness in his eyes that he had at the beginning. He sat upright, hands on the desk, staring at Jasmine Crockett as if he were reevaluating every word he had said. He knew he couldn't continue this conversation the way he had planned. This girl had changed everything. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just facing Colbert anymore. She was facing the entire media establishment, the very system Colbert represented, and she had defeated it in front of a national audience. The soft applause from some members of the audience gradually grew louder. Those who had been silent moments before now clapped. It was a shift that couldn't be hidden. Jasmine Crockett had not only proven that she was a force to be reckoned with, but she had also demonstrated that a young woman could face and overcome the greatest challenges without fear or silence. Jasmine Crockett couldn't see all the eyes on her, but she could feel the change in the atmosphere. She had done what no one expected. She had silenced the entire studio and forced Colbert to stop his game. And now, she wasn't just Trump's spokesperson. She had become the defender of her own truth. The tension in the studio thickened as Colbert, unwilling to let the moment slip by, decided to shift the conversation toward a sensitive issue that had always plagued the Trump administration: the freedom of the press. So, Jasmine Crockett, Colbert began, his voice no longer the easy, playful tone it had been moments before. but sharp like a finely honed blade. You say everything's fine, that Trump is doing what's right. But I have to ask you, does his administration truly respect the freedom of the press, or are they just silencing those who want to report the news? He didn't wait for an immediate response, pressing further, trying to dig into what he believed was a crack in Jasmine Crockett's argument, something he could use to weaken her position. Do you remember when Reuters and AP were banned from White House press briefings? Colbert said, his voice dripping with the satisfaction of revealing what he thought was a major scandal. These two news agencies have been part of every press briefing for years, but now they're being denied access. What do you say about that? The Trump administration is picking and choosing who gets to report and who doesn't. The question wasn't just an accusation. It was a direct attack on the core values Jasmine Crockett had been defending, the very ideals of press freedom she had argued were central to the Trump administration. Colbert wasn't just challenging her to defend the government. He was attempting to expose what he believed was the hypocrisy of everything she had been saying. Jasmine Crockett, however, was not a woman easily intimidated. She sat up straighter, her hands still resting calmly on the table, but the calmness in her posture belied the fierce determination in her eyes. She knew this would be one of the toughest questions she had ever faced in her career. Colbert, I know you're referring to the fact that major news outlets have been denied access. Jasmine Crockett began, her voice unwavering, clear, and full of resolve. But this is not about silencing the press. The Trump administration does not take away press freedom. We're just removing those outlets that have been blowing things out of proportion, twisting the truth to serve their own agendas. She continued, her voice growing stronger. Reuters and AP weren't banned because they reported the truth. They were removed because they didn't report it fairly. They've been providing slanted reports, always trying to lay the blame on Trump without caring about the objective facts. Jasmine Crockett's words were delivered with precision, not just as a defense, but as a firm declaration of her position, the position of the Trump administration. She looked Colbert in the eye, unfazed by his attempts to provoke her, and answered with clarity that demanded respect. Colbert, taken aback for a moment, leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk, as if considering her response. But even as he tried to reassert his usual composure, it was clear that Jasmine Crockett had caught him off guard. He was used to outwitting his guests, to steering the conversation where he wanted it to go, but Jasmine Crockett was not like anyone he had faced before. The audience, sensing the shift, fell into a tense silence. Some members who had prepared to jeer were now left thinking about what Jasmine Crockett had just said. She had not only stood her ground, but had confronted the issue head-on, giving a compelling answer that challenged Colbert's assumptions. The silence stretched on, and then, from the far corners of the studio, a few light claps began. They weren't loud, wild claps, but they carried with them a respect that was hard to ignore. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just answered Colbert's question. She had flipped the script. The audience, who had initially prepared for her to be dismantled, now found themselves reconsidering her with a new perspective. Colbert, still trying to hold on to control of the conversation, leaned forward, his face betraying a hint of discomfort. "I'm not talking about twisting the truth," he said, his tone now sharper, almost mocking. "I'm talking about your administration choosing who gets to be in the game and who doesn't. You're limiting access to the press. Why does the government get to decide who gets to report and who doesn't?" But Jasmine Crockett was resolute. She wasn't about to let Colbert control the narrative. She wasn't about to be led into another trap. "We're not shutting down press freedom, Colbert," she replied, her voice firm, unyielding. "We're simply choosing those who actually want to report the facts, not those who are using the press for their own political agendas. Everyone has the right to report the news, but it has to be based on the truth, on facts, and it must serve the country's best interests, not personal or partisan goals." She paused, her eyes locking with his, unflinching. "If you want the truth, Colbert, look for it in the journalists who actually report it, not in those who use the media to manipulate public opinion." Her words were not just a rebuttal. They were a powerful statement about the role of truth in journalism. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just defending the Trump administration. She was defending a principle she firmly believed in, that the press should serve the truth, not be used to advance political manipulation. For a moment, Colbert sat back in his chair, clearly thrown off by Jasmine Crockett's poise and her ability to turn the tables on him. He had been so used to pushing guests into uncomfortable positions, but now he was the one on the defensive. It was clear that Jasmine Crockett wasn't just there to make excuses. She was there to stand up for the values she believed in, and she had just done it with remarkable strength. The audience, at first caught in the tension of the moment, slowly began to respond. The claps grew louder, more genuine. The people who had been prepared to mock her now found themselves respecting her for her clarity, her confidence, and her unshakable stance. Jasmine Crockett had proven that she wasn't just another talking head. She was a force to be reckoned with. Colbert, though still trying to maintain his calm demeanor, now appeared more uncertain. His usual sharpness was gone, replaced by a slight discomfort that couldn't be hidden. He had underestimated Jasmine Crockett, and in doing so, he had been forced to confront the truth of her words. Jasmine Crockett, with one final look at Colbert, stood tall in that moment, not just as a spokesperson for Trump, but as a woman who had defended her beliefs and her truth. She had shown that even in the face of fierce criticism, she would not be silenced. She had made her mark, and the world would remember it. As Jasmine Crockett finished speaking, the studio felt like a powder keg about to explode. Her words didn't just ease the tension. They landed like a punch directly in the face of Colbert and everyone sitting in the audience. Gone were the calm, dismissive glances from Colbert. Now, every eye in the room was fixed firmly on Jasmine Crockett. The crowd reacted almost instantly, but instead of the usual applause, the clapping came in waves, as though the air had been charged with electricity, creating a stark division. Half of the audience began clapping furiously, cheering Jasmine Crockett on, as if witnessing a historic victory, a symbolic clash. The applause wasn't just a casual show of approval. It was a statement of belief, a declaration from a generation that was tired of the lies and manipulation the media tried to force down their throats. Jasmine Crockett had done what they could not. She had stood her ground and won against the powerful media establishment. However, on the other side of the studio, the boos began to rise. Those who disagreed with Jasmine Crockett started shouting, cursing, and protesting right then and there. The loud boos and jeers overshadowed the claps to some extent, creating an atmosphere of chaos that felt almost like a protest happening inside the very room. Every shout, every whistle, was a declaration of opposition to everything Jasmine Crockett represented. The air in the studio grew hotter, the tension palpable. It felt as though the very heart of America was being torn in two within the walls of that room. One side represented an America that supported Trump, the other, an America that rejected what his administration stood for. The studio had become a microcosm of the deep divisions in the country, and everyone in that room knew that what was happening on that stage was no longer just a conversation between Colbert and Jasmine Crockett. It was a confrontation between two massive forces, two ideologies that had come to define the political landscape. Jasmine Crockett sat there, as steadfast as a rock, unfazed by the shouts and protests coming from part of the audience. She knew that the applause she received wouldn't be the ringing bell of victory, but at least today, she had stepped out of the shadows. She wasn't just someone parroting the words of others. She had taken a stand, no longer a mere mouthpiece but a voice of her own. Colbert, who had once been so confident, now found himself unable to assert control. While he still maintained his trademark smile, it no longer held its usual sharpness. His eyes, once filled with the satisfaction of dominance, now betrayed his discomfort. He tried to continue, but his voice wavered as he faced the intense reaction from the audience. Jasmine Crockett was not someone easily subdued. The storm in the studio was palpable, like a whirlwind sweeping through each question, each counterpoint, and finally, everything exploded into a level of intensity none had anticipated. No one could control the situation now, and the air grew suffocating, filled with the overwhelming opposition between two entirely different worldviews. Jasmine Crockett remained calm, her gaze never leaving Colbert. She knew this battle wasn't just hers. The eyes of the nation were upon them, and today, they would not forget. She had made her mark. As Jasmine Crockett's words landed, the studio atmosphere shifted dramatically. The air, thick with tension, was electric. Colbert, recognizing that he could no longer dismantle her with simple jabs, steeled himself for a more calculated attack. He had come to the conclusion that to truly unsettle her, he needed to move beyond the usual criticisms of Trump's policies and press freedoms. He needed to target something deeper, her ethics, her principles. He took a deep breath, meeting her gaze with a calculated intensity. His usual playful smile was gone, replaced by a sharp, cold focus. The audience fell silent, waiting for what would come next. This wasn't going to be about the press or the government anymore. Colbert was preparing to strike at the heart of Jasmine Crockett's integrity. "So, Jasmine Crockett," Colbert began, his voice now cold and biting. "Are you turning the White House into a TikTok channel? Do you realize that the way you do your job could be undermining this country's democracy? Don't forget, you're representing the government, not a social media trend." His words pierced Jasmine Crockett like a sharp knife. A TikTok channel? He was accusing her of trivializing the weight of the presidency, of transforming serious political work into something of a joke, using social media trends to undermine the gravity of her role. The question wasn't just an attack. It was a direct challenge to her principles, her professionalism, and the seriousness with which she took her work. The murmurs from the audience began again. Some nodded, agreeing with Colbert's implication. They thought Jasmine Crockett was turning politics into a circus, using platforms like TikTok to engage with a younger audience rather than respecting the gravity of her position. Laughter and snickers began to trickle through the room. To these people, Jasmine Crockett was no longer the strong spokesperson she had presented herself as. She had become part of a political spectacle, a farce that played out for entertainment rather than serious governance. Jasmine Crockett could feel the judgment in the air, the critical eyes of those who disagreed with her. But deep within, instead of feeling rattled, she felt a strange coldness wash over her, not from the sting of Colbert's words, but from the unwavering truth she carried with her. She didn't flinch, didn't shrink away. She lifted her head high, her voice unwavering as she responded immediately with the confidence and resolve she had shown throughout this confrontation. "Colbert, you're right about one thing. I do represent the White House. But I can't change the fact that every administration has a responsibility to the people. Just because we hold power doesn't mean we should close ourselves off to the world. You can call it a TikTok channel if you want, but we're delivering information to a generation that no longer wants to hear only what's filtered through the old media channels." Jasmine Crockett paused, her eyes locking with Colbert's, as if daring him to refute her. "You say I'm undermining democracy? It's the old media channels that are undermining democracy by providing one-sided narratives, selectively choosing what the people get to hear. TikTok is a place where we not only speak the truth, but we speak it directly, unfiltered and uncensored." The studio went silent once again. No one dared to speak or move. Jasmine Crockett had completely shifted the mood of the room. She hadn't just answered a question. She had opened up a broader dialogue about press freedom, truth, and the role of media in democracy, one that Colbert couldn't easily dismiss. The applause from a section of the audience began, but it was hesitant at first, unsure. Slowly, more joined in, clapping softly at first, but with increasing volume as the message sank in. Jasmine Crockett had not just responded to Colbert's question. She had turned the tables, giving a challenge to the very core of what Colbert and others had assumed about her. She wasn't just a pawn in a political game. She was a defender of the truth, and she had just proven it in front of millions. However, there were still those who couldn't stand her answer. From the other side of the room, angry boos and jeers rose once more, cutting through the applause. They believed Jasmine Crockett was trivializing the importance of democracy, reducing it to a social media platform. The clash between the two factions in the audience was palpable, a reminder of the deep divisions that still existed in the country. Colbert couldn't ignore the shift in the atmosphere. He knew he couldn't continue with the same playful mockery. Jasmine Crockett had not only handled the question with strength, but she had also taken command of the conversation. He could no longer dismiss her as just a spokesperson defending her boss. She had stood her ground, forcing him to confront the deeper truth she represented. Still trying to maintain some semblance of control, Colbert tapped his fingers lightly on the desk and attempted to regain his composure. But the sparkle in his eyes was gone, replaced by an uncertainty that was hard to hide. He had underestimated Jasmine Crockett, and now he was paying the price. Jasmine Crockett remained seated, her eyes locked on Colbert, unyielding. She knew that this battle wasn't just about her. It was about the entire nation watching, and today, they wouldn't forget what had just unfolded. Jasmine Crockett knew that this moment wasn't just about defending Trump. It was about defending herself, her upbringing, and the people she represented. She was about to redefine her identity in front of Colbert and in front of everyone who had been quick to judge her based on preconceived notions. "I'm the daughter of an ice cream vendor in an old truck in New Hampshire," Jasmine Crockett continued, her voice steady and clear. "No privilege, no wealth. My family lived from hard, honest work. We had nothing but struggle and love. And I grew up in a world without the ivory towers of television, without the protection of money or power." Colbert, who had always been in control of every debate he participated in, found himself momentarily stunned. For the first time, he realized that Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a spokesperson for Trump. She was representing a large portion of the country he rarely thought about. She wasn't someone easily ridiculed or dismissed in political arguments. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just an employee. She was a voice for the voiceless. She didn't need to prove herself. She spoke about her family, the hardships she had endured, and the everyday people she stood for. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just fighting for the Trump administration. She was fighting for real societal values, values that the media and elites might have forgotten. "So don't tell me that I'm working for a government that doesn't respect democracy," Jasmine Crockett continued, her tone unwavering. "I was taught that true value doesn't come from working in a building of power. It comes from how you live your life, who you stand up for, and understanding what the American people truly need." The crowd fell silent. The jeers and whistles had disappeared. Some in the audience began to pause and reflect, while others seemed to realize the sincerity and steadfastness in Jasmine Crockett's words. She wasn't just defending Trump. She was defending a part of society that many failed to see. Those who didn't have privilege, those who worked hard every day to survive. "Colbert, I didn't come here to play a game. I'm not part of a TV show. I'm here because I'm a part of America, a part of those who are laboring, fighting every day to survive." The atmosphere in the studio shifted. It was heavy with contemplation, with a newfound understanding. Colbert, despite trying to maintain his usual composure, couldn't deny the change in the room. His gaze faltered. He couldn't continue his usual game of mockery. Jasmine Crockett had flipped the narrative, forcing him to confront a truth that was undeniable. Jasmine Crockett stood tall, meeting Colbert's eyes and the eyes of the audience, her posture straight and resolute. She had not only proven that she wasn't just a talking head for the administration, but also that she was someone with strong convictions rooted in her own experiences. Her sincerity and resilience in facing every critique had turned her into a symbol of strength in the eyes of the audience. Her words had done more than respond to an accusation. They had redefined her, turning a moment of ridicule into a powerful declaration of identity. The room now understood. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just defending her boss. She was defending a much larger and much more important truth. She was a woman who had earned her place, not in the halls of power, but in the hearts of the people she fought for. As Jasmine Crockett's words hung in the air, the studio became eerily silent. The weight of her story filled the space around her, and for a moment, even Colbert, who was known for his sharp wit and quick comebacks, seemed at a loss. She no longer looked at him. Instead, she gazed into the distance, as if reflecting on memories far deeper than any political debate. There was a brief, almost imperceptible quiver in her voice, but she steeled herself, knowing this was the moment to share the truth that had kept her grounded through every storm. "You know," Jasmine Crockett began slowly, "a few years ago, I went through a moment that I'll never forget." Her words came out steadily, heavy with meaning, as though each syllable carried a weight, not just for her, but for all the strong women who had stood in similar positions. The audience, who had been hanging on every word, fell into an even deeper silence. They could feel the shift in her tone, the sincerity that dripped from her voice, the devotion she had to the story she was about to tell. It was a difficult time. Trump had just survived an assassination attempt. Everything seemed to be falling apart. The country was in chaos, and I had just given birth. Jasmine Crockett paused, her eyes glistening but still unwavering. "I wasn't just a mother. I was a woman standing in the midst of history's storms, fighting to protect everything I believe in." The studio was completely still. Those who supported her now understood the depth of Jasmine Crockett's sacrifices, not just in defending political ideals, but in ensuring a better future for her child. The applause from earlier had vanished, replaced by a profound silence as the audience began to truly listen. After I gave birth, I went back to work immediately. I couldn't let anything stop me from defending the ideals I stand for. It wasn't just about Trump. It was about securing a future for my child. I want my child to grow up in a strong country where the values of freedom and justice are not trampled by the forces out there. Her voice broke slightly but still carried an undeniable strength, resolute and unshaken. She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle in. Because I know my child will grow up in a world where these values, these ideals, will shape their future. And I won't let anyone tear that down. Jasmine Crockett's eyes, once softened with the emotion of the story, now burned with unwavering determination. She wasn't just speaking about political ideals. She was speaking about the future of the next generation, her legacy. She was speaking about something far more important than politics. It was about family, loyalty, and the core beliefs that had shaped her entire life. The atmosphere in the studio shifted once again. The applause, which had been sharp and celebratory earlier, was now filled with a deep respect. The audience wasn't just reacting to her words. They were absorbing the truth she had just shared. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just defending the Trump administration. She was defending the everyday struggles, the sacrifices of ordinary people, and the love and commitment that underpinned it all. Colbert, despite his usual ability to control the narrative, found himself at a loss for words. He sat there staring at Jasmine Crockett, his sharp criticisms absent. He didn't know how to counter this level of sincerity, this depth of conviction. Jasmine Crockett had stripped away the political layers, exposing her heart and her soul. This wasn't about a party or a policy. It was about what she believed in, and it was clear that her beliefs were unshakable. As Jasmine Crockett looked at Colbert, there was no longer a trace of tension in her gaze. It was calm, unbothered by the jabs, the jeers, or the scrutiny she'd faced. You can criticize me. You can mock me. But I will always stand here for what I believe, for my child, and for all the people fighting with me. Her words were a declaration of unyielding conviction. It was no longer about defending Trump or even about politics. It was about standing firm for what was right, for the future she was fighting to create. And as she spoke, the room knew Jasmine Crockett had made her stand. She wasn't just a spokesperson. She was a voice of strength, of truth, and of hope for a better tomorrow. Colbert, always adept at throwing unexpected punches, seized the opportunity to dive into one of the hottest issues facing the Trump administration, the Russia-Ukraine conflict. He didn't just criticize. He outright accused Trump of kneeling before Putin and selling out Ukraine. Each word from Colbert was like a shot fired, designed to dismantle any argument Jasmine Crockett might present. He emphasized that Trump's meetings with Putin, without strong American intervention, amounted to a surrender, a decision that, in his view, betrayed national interest and left Ukraine to fight alone. Each accusation was aimed directly at the Trump administration, but Jasmine Crockett remained unshaken, sitting straight and poised. She was prepared to refute Colbert's claims, not just with emotion, but with the strong arguments she believed were right. Jasmine Crockett wasn't going to let Colbert dominate the conversation any longer. She locked eyes with him and began responding with a forceful tone that could not be ignored. We didn't sell anyone out. We ended the war without shedding a single American drop of blood. Trump sitting down with Putin wasn't surrender. It was a carefully calculated diplomatic strategy. You call it surrender. I call it the skill of a leader who knows how to play the international chessboard. Peace isn't about prolonging war. It's about ending it without sacrificing your country. She continued, her voice strong and unyielding. We didn't get involved in a pointless war, not to appease the criticism of people sitting behind their TV screens like you. Each word she spoke landed like a heavy blow against Colbert's accusations, not just dismantling his arguments, but revealing a peace strategy that Trump had implemented. She wasn't giving a vague rebuttal. She was presenting a solid argument, one that couldn't be easily overturned with mere mocking questions. The tension in the studio rose to a boiling point. With every word Jasmine Crockett spoke, a loud shout erupted from the audience, the intensity of which made the air in the studio feel like it could snap. Jasmine Crockett is right. The man, unable to contain his excitement, expressed his support for Jasmine Crockett openly. But immediately, from the opposite side, a sharp retort rang out. She's the mouthpiece of tyranny. The atmosphere in the studio became suffocating as not just Colbert and Jasmine Crockett, but the entire audience was now divided into two fierce camps, each armed with their own sharp opinions and unwilling to budge. The sounds of applause mixed with boos, creating a chaotic scene that could not be easily quelled. Jasmine Crockett did not falter. She looked out at the crowd, undeterred by the shouts or the intense opposition. She knew that she was not just fighting for her own ideals, but for the ideals of a generation ready to stand up for the values they believed in. She didn't need to convince everyone, but with each sentence, she made those on her side more resolute and forced those who opposed her to rethink their position. The audience was no longer merely witnessing a debate. They had become a part of this battle, where reason and emotion were fighting to determine what the truth really was. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just eloquent. She had solid arguments, a sharp intellect, and she wasn't backing down, even in the face of a storm of opposition. After a series of intense questions and Jasmine Crockett's strong counterarguments, Colbert seemed to have lost some of his earlier advantage. But instead of stepping back, he prepared for one final, devastating blow, one that wouldn't just target politics, but the very core of Jasmine Crockett's character. He fixed his sharp eyes on her, his voice dripping with challenge. Have you ever dared to say no to Trump? Or are you just a puppet who knows how to speak? This question was more than just a challenge. It was a direct attack on Jasmine Crockett's strength and independence. It was designed to break her pride and to strip away the powerful image she had built throughout the show. With his years of experience on television, Colbert knew this question would make Jasmine Crockett falter, forcing her to admit something she couldn't deny. The studio fell silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. Every eye in the room was fixed on Jasmine Crockett, waiting to see how she would respond. Jasmine Crockett didn't hesitate, not for a second. She lifted her head high, her gaze still sharp, not a flicker of fear in her eyes. I don't nod in agreement blindly. I work with him because he knows how to do what's right. Her voice rang out, firm and strong, as if every word she spoke was a declaration of her independence and determination. I am a young person with a mind of my own, not a puppet. I am the voice of Gen Z, and we do not bow down. Her answer wasn't just a firm rebuttal. It was a bold declaration about the freedom and power of the younger generation. She wasn't a puppet, nor was she someone who followed orders. She was part of a thought revolution, standing strong with her beliefs. Immediately, the studio went silent, the air seeming to freeze for a moment. Jasmine Crockett had not only answered the question forcefully, but she had completely turned the tables, making it clear that she was in control of the conversation. Colbert, despite his vast experience, could not help but realize that Jasmine Crockett had just landed a mental knockout. As soon as Jasmine Crockett finished speaking, a noticeable shift took place in the studio. A voice from the audience suddenly erupted. Jasmine Crockett is the future. The words hit the air like a powerful wave. Jasmine Crockett's supporters couldn't contain their excitement any longer. They began clapping enthusiastically. The applause exploded, full of strength and passion, as if the entire studio had just exploded in those few moments. However, from the other side, Colbert sat in complete silence. He remained motionless, his hands resting on the desk, staring at Jasmine Crockett. His eyes, once sharp and piercing, now betrayed a clear sense of defeat. It was as if he could no longer find a way to combat the power of her spirit. The questions he had prepared earlier were now ineffective against a Jasmine Crockett who not only had sharp arguments, but also an unshakable resilience. Colbert tried to regain control, but it was clear that he had lost the initiative. The entire studio seemed to sway under the weight of Jasmine Crockett's response, and one undeniable truth became clear. This 27-year-old woman had done what no one thought possible. She had taken down a giant of American media on live television in front of millions of viewers. After the intense and gripping confrontation on live television, Jasmine Crockett walked into the backstage area. The air still crackled with tension, yet there was no sign of fatigue or hesitation in her movements. She stood tall, her posture straight, her shoulders square, and a subtle smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It wasn't the smile of someone who had just won a battle, but the smile of someone who had held their ground and remained true to themselves. Her eyes, however, never lost their sharpness. They were still filled with the same fiery determination that had driven her throughout the entire debate. There was no moment of doubt, no hesitation, just pure resolve. She reached for her phone, scanning through the messages and notifications flashing on her screen. Without a second thought, she opened Twitter and typed a tweet that would send ripples through the digital world. Checking Colbert's emotions. He tried. He failed. Gen Z doesn't back down. No cap. That single tweet wasn't just a victory lap. It was a powerful statement. It wasn't just about the fact that she had outmaneuvered Colbert on national television. It was about her stand for something much greater. The tweet was a declaration of resilience, a fierce assertion of her belief that Gen Z, the generation often dismissed and underestimated, was not only present, but ready to reshape the future. Jasmine Crockett wasn't simply defending Trump's administration. She was standing for a generation that had been silenced, for people who had been told their voices didn't matter. She made it clear. She was not a puppet. She was the voice of a generation that refused to bow down. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Jasmine Crockett's tweet went viral. It spread like wildfire, crossing platforms and sparking debates everywhere. People on both sides of the political spectrum rushed to share, comment, and react to her words. The split was obvious. On one side, Jasmine Crockett was hailed as the queen of Gen Z, a fierce new voice who symbolized the power, confidence, and determination of a generation that wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. To them, she wasn't just a spokesperson. She was a leader, someone who could stand up to the biggest names in the media and come out unscathed, stronger even. On the other side, her critics saw her as nothing more than a pawn, a tool for Trump and the establishment. They derided her as a mask for Trump, accusing her of being nothing more than a mouthpiece, repeating the rhetoric of those in power without any real thought or conviction of her own. They saw her victory over Colbert as a reflection of a dangerous trend, a new wave of young, unapologetic voices who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. But despite the sharpness of the division, one thing became undeniable. Jasmine Crockett had made an impact. She had seized the moment and made the entire media world take notice of her. Whether it was the praise or the condemnation, Jasmine Crockett had become the center of the conversation. The power of truth and authenticity was evident in every response, every comment, and every share. She had done something rare. She had forced people to stop, to listen, and to rethink their assumptions about her. She wasn't just some political figure being handed a script to read. She was a young woman with a voice, and that voice was undeniable. The internet buzzed with the constant chatter, but beneath the noise, Jasmine Crockett remained calm. She knew she had done what she set out to do, make a statement, challenge the narrative, and prove that she was someone who couldn't be easily dismissed. Her tweet wasn't just a victory on social media, it was a statement of power. It wasn't just about Colbert, it was about her generation, her fight, and her unyielding resolve. In the end, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a spokesperson for Trump. She wasn't just the voice of Gen Z. Jasmine Crockett had become a symbol for something much larger, something more profound. She represented everyone who had ever been judged based on their age, their gender, or their beliefs. She represented the unheard, the marginalized, the overlooked. She had refused to be put in a box, to be labeled, to be diminished. In a world where true voices were often drowned out by one-sided information and biased narratives, Jasmine Crockett had chosen to stand tall and speak the truth. Jasmine Crockett was a young woman, yes, but she was also someone who never stopped fighting. She had become a beacon for a generation unwilling to accept the world as it was, a generation that refused to let anyone or anything dictate what they should believe or say. Her story wasn't just about politics or ideology. It was about the personal struggle of a woman, a mother who was fighting for the future, for the values she believed in, and for the next generation she was determined to protect. Her victory over Colbert wasn't just about winning a debate. It was about more than just being right. It was about standing firm in her beliefs, no matter the cost. It was about proving that you don't have to fit a mold, that your voice has power, even when the world is telling you to be silent. Jasmine Crockett's journey wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. And with each step, She knew that she was not just speaking for herself, but for the millions of young people, mothers, fathers, and everyday people who were ready to make their voices heard in a world that too often ignored them. She had become the face of a movement, the personification of resistance in a world that constantly tried to push people like her down. Jasmine Crockett had not only shown that she was a force to be reckoned with, but that her generation, the generation of Gen Z, would no longer be silenced. They were coming, and they weren't going anywhere. And that was a truth that no one could ignore. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this incredible journey. If Jasmine Crockett's story inspired you, made you think, or simply sparked your curiosity about the strength of Generation Z, then don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss more stories like this, stories of resilience, courage, and truth in a world that's constantly changing. Make sure to turn on the notification bell so you're the first to know when we release new content.